Hi.
This, so many faces I know. Lucky you. I like this.
This is a great group.
We got a good one here.
Okay. This is the second of a multi-part video series on Ecce, Homo, Yam, so Y's, the final version of part 3 and the variant of part 3. And last time we were studying the final version of part 3, section 3. And here's what we said. The final version of part 3 appeared in December of 1888. Nietzsche probably wrote it in late December of 1888, so very close to the time of his mental breakdown. It was intercepted by his editor and not published. In the first version of Ecce Homo to appear in German in 1910, a different section was printed. It was the section that had been approved up until late December of 1888, and that's the only section that's the only version of Y's 3 that we knew about until very recently, until the 60s. And in the 60s, we uncovered the true section 3, and with Nietzsche's instructions that it should replace the earlier section. Now, most people feel that to follow the scenario of Nietzsche's mental breakdown, people reading it with that in mind see that here it is closer to the end, and what we are seeing closer to the end is an even crazier Nietzsche than we saw earlier. Before I continue, I was having a conversation with Mr. Gerard, the biology teacher today, and he told me the following fact. He said that he just had read about an experiment on rats in which they took the smell associated in a rat's brain the smell of honeysuckle and an electric shock, and in the male line, we know, or we were able to detect that the descendants, once they smelled honeysuckle, fled for fear that there would be an electric shock associated with it. And the conclusion is that the electric shock caused a overexpression of a gene by an epigenetic, and that we are looking at solid evidence of transgenerational epigenetic heritability following this experiment. So we have established transgenerational epigenetic heritability in mice. That's very significant. So it's not just that the environment shapes our epigene after we're conceived, but we can in fact inherit an epigenetic along with the base epigene, the base DNA. We can inherit it as per the experience of, and it's through the father's side, because, and Gerard's speculation, which was good speculation, is why else would it be that sperm cells renew themselves every day? It's only so that we can continue in the stream of being able to continuously pass on experiences of what's dangerous and what's safe, and associations that we shouldn't have, and that's how the species has survived. And that's the one good reason why sperm cells are renewed daily. Whereas to the mother's side, we don't have that. The egg cell DNA stays the same, but sperm cell DNA changes on a daily basis. So just that as a little aside too. But I'm increasingly very, very confident in saying that someday it will be very obvious that this is not philosophy, but psychobiology, and that Nietzsche was the first explorer of the psychobiology of the epigenetic self. And that's what we're reading here. And turning it into philosophy is absolute nonsense. All right. Let me review a little bit of what we were saying last time about the final version of section 3 of Ecce Homo why I'm so wise. And we'll see why there's quite a few things to discuss, and we'll overlook several of them. I want to focus on just one point. I'm going to now touch upon, he says, the question of genealogy or descent, because Ecce Homo is all about genealogy. I moved the computer monitor so we can get that should all come in nicer. In a lot of the previous videos, the computer monitor is right in front of the overhead. I'm a Polish nobleman, poor Sam, that's false. With which not a drop of blood is mixed, least of all German blood. That actually is false. We did genealogical tracing in Nietzsche, and he was not Polish, he did not come from Polish nobility, and he was German on both sides of his family. There is a speculation by the person who brought forward the new section 3 of Ecce Homo wise, that the reason why Nietzsche is interested in disassociating himself from any blood relationship to here is he's trying to disassociate himself in particular from a blood relationship to his sister. And he's doing that because of an event that occurred in August of 1882. His sister reacted very harshly to his relationship with his girlfriend at the time, Lou Salome, so much so that it suggested an almost incestuous desire for Nietzsche. So the reading goes. And Nietzsche is reacting to this horror of incestuous feelings from his sister that maybe he even has in return, and that this has to do with, this explains why he says that he has no blood relationship to them. The fact is, however, I don't know if that's true, but we do have a text in which he says that he is a descendant of the Poles that is prior to August of 1882 when his sister Elizabeth met Lou Salome. It comes from the summer of 1882. So, although it doesn't say that he has no blood relationship to them, he does say in that text that he's a descendant of the Poles. But sometimes people, that aside, people have pointed to the idea, to the claim to be a Polish nobleman as evidence right here that Nietzsche was crazy at the end. But if he's been saying that as early as 1882, as early as the summer of 1882, it's in volume 9 of the KSA, then maybe there's figurative language or figurative thinking behind this, and not a literal thought at all. And we'll see when we look at the earlier section 3, which this replaced. There's also mention of being Polish, and we'll see a context for it. But let's skip that over that a little bit and move on. When I look for the profoundest opposite, ineradicable vulgarity of the instincts, I always find my mother and sister. To think of myself as related to such canaille would be a blasphemy against my divinity. We talked a little bit about it on the last tape, so I'm going to go faster. The term canaille is a French term that means the lowest classes of, and uneducated classes of society. People have pointed to this sentence, it sounds very condemning of Nietzsche, to say that there is a slur, a Lacerung, I think is the right word in German, against his divinity. Sounds like he thinks he's God. But the fact is that the sentence internally makes no sense. It begins to make sense if we go back to an important section, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, called Old and New Tablets. And in Old and New Tablets, he says, a new nobility is needed, or as I once said in a parable, that alone is godlike, that there are gods but no God. So, in Ecce Homo of Old and New Tablets, we have an association between the godlike and the new nobility. If divinity is figurative language for the new nobility, then this sentence begins to make sense, because, and maybe we can argue maybe why he thinks of his new nobility as divine-like. Maybe it is, in some meaningful concept of divine. In any case, if we think about the divinity as, if we think about his divinity as his new nobility, then this sentence, and only then, first begins to make sense, because it then reads, to say that I'm related to such low classes of the society would be to impugn my noble descent, which is all about nobility and descent. So that maybe we can say something about the Polish, the claim to being Polish, as figurative language that makes this seem like such a crazy text, and maybe we could say something about this line about his divinity that makes it seem not such a crazy text. Here's the point that I want to focus on. The treatment I have experienced at the hands of my mother and sister right up to this moment fills me with unspeakable horror. Here, a perfectly infernal machine, as it were, unerringly sure of the moment when a bloody wound can be inflicted on me in my most exalted moments. For at such times, one lacks all power to defend oneself against poisonous vermin. This text has been pointed to as, and this is the reason why it was suppressed, as so full of anger and hatred at his mother and sister that he must have been mentally unhinged at the time, because even though they may not have been the perfect mother and sister, they didn't do anything that deserved this degree of condemnation and vituperative language, just to call them poisonous vermin. So Montanari, who brought this text forward and is a great philologist, makes the claim that right here we see Nietzsche's loss of proportionality at the end. Nietzsche's loss of perspective. The poor man had already descended into a mental chaos, and we have no assurance that any final form of his work was in his mind. Like Homo itself is chaos. Who knows what to make of Nietzsche? And the answer is, I'll show you in a second what to make of this passage, and it's a failure of reading on Montanari's part to have made the claim he made. Watch. Physiological contiguity makes such a disharmonia. Well, this is a play on an earlier philosopher in Germany, Leibniz. This is a pre-established disharmony. He thinks that there was almost a metaphysical, it's not serious, an almost metaphysical disharmony between himself and his mother and sister. But that's not serious enough. But here's the key line. I confess that the most profound objection against the eternal occurrence, my truly abyssal thought, is always my mother and sister. Right. Now, we talked a little bit about the eternal occurrence last time, did we not?
We did.
Remind me of the eternal occurrence, Shelley. Why don't we put Shelley in camera? Because this always happens. This always happens, and I think that the viewers, whoever see it, think I'm speaking to an empty class. There are true human beings here responding. Remind me of the eternal recurrence, Shelley.
I have almost forgot, but it's a book. One of
It's in Zarathustra.
yeah. It's a one chapter you ask us to read.
On redemption.
Yeah, redemption.
Yeah.
That. Is it about pity?
Not really. No. But it's about, it's the topic under discussion in on redemption is the topic of the spirit of revenge.
Oh.
And the idea of the eternal recurrence is that as a corrective to the spirit of revenge. That doesn't appear in On Redemption itself, but the whole unfolding of the story of Zarathustra leaves us with that outcome. Having finally conquered the spirit of revenge
So
through willing the eternal recurrence, Nietzsche is as extending life and becoming stronger in life. Yeah, that's exactly right. So the summary of the complex psychology is something like this. The will has been preoccupied, and from an epigenetic point of view, this starts to make sense. The will is preoccupied by its frustration with the pastness of the past. And I've suggested over and over, we have no reason to believe that archaic human beings, say 60,000 years ago, even thought about a past. I think about my past all the time. I think about the mistakes I made in graduate school. I think about the mistakes I made when I was involved in the stock market, the mistakes I made in relationships. I can't get free of it. I dream about it. I can't shake my past. But we don't know that archaic human beings constructed such elaborate pasts for themselves. Maybe they just lived, they moved on from one day to the next, and the day's worry about survival and not being eaten by anything and finding enough food and water was pretty much all they worried about, and did not become focused on a past.
So expect the past to repeat again.
No. What Nietzsche is recognizing is that as time has gone by, he doesn't say this, but I say this, I think this can be filled in. As time has gone by, because it's difficult to understand why we have always been preoccupied with the past, but if we are the inheritors of a epigenetic history that extends deep into our past, then maybe the weakening of life that we've been accumulating over generation and generation as on the same part of the DNA as the epigenetic has been wearing us down, has made us so weak that we can't turn away from the past. Or the past has become, the accumulative trauma of the past has become mesmerizing. We can't turn away from it. It's become an obsession. Now that would be a nightmare if that's what's happening in the human race. That the accumulating traumas are so horrible that we can't forget them.
So how can we overcome?
Well, Nietzsche doesn't say that we have inherited trauma and that that's why we have become focused on the pastness of the past. I said that,
Yeah,
maybe. But it fits. He notices that we are focused on the pastness of the past, and the will is very frustrated because it can't change the past, and it becomes vengeful and strikes back, and because of its frustration in having to live with this past that is constantly causing it sorrow and grief. So Nietzsche says what's happening is that because the will is so paralyzed by the unreachable pastness of the past, it isn't lived free to do what its true job is to do, which is to strengthen life against its weaknesses. And so the will is kind of locked up in this preoccupation and fixation on the pastness of the past, and what we have to do is get it over that preoccupation and stop wanting to change the past. And once we do, it'll give it restore to it its ability to strengthen life and advance us as a species. So the first step is, what do we do to get the will to not want the past to change? And the answer is, well, we have to get it to we have to get the will to will the past as it is. But as we said, the past is past and willing is forward. So to will that, to say, I want that past, is almost an impossible thing to do given the nature of the forward directedness of willing. So to want that past means to will, which is forward moving, that past to be what is the one to come. His idea is that if I will the past forward, I will overcome the spirit of revenge which weakens life in us. And if I overcome the life-weakening spirit of revenge, I will become a stronger being. So it's not just that I live in the, it's not, I don't actually end up with that same past. I am just using the willing of the past forward as a second-order psychological strategy to advance another psychological effect of richer and abundant life. Now, what this text says is, I wasn't able to do that in the case of my mother and sister. I confess that the most profound objection against the eternal recurrence, which is the most difficult thought I have, because I have to will the recurrence of the people that I most want to renounce. I mean, you want to will the recurrence of Adolf Hitler? But the issue is, and the issue is not a moral issue. The issue is, it might not be significant to you if, that's not the best example in a way, but if you were a Jewish person, would you be? So the point is, the discipline of willing the eternal recurrence is only relevant to you to the extent of how difficult it is for you to will the recurrence of that individual or that situation. If you're kind of indifferent, it doesn't make any difference. So his point is that I'm extremely involved in the feelings toward my mother and sister, and by my doctrine of eternal recurrence, if I want to free myself from feelings of renunciation, I should force myself to will them to recur. And that's my personal challenge, because that's where I feel the greatest force of renunciation, because this is where I'm most invested.
So that's second order psychology.
Now, this is where I'm most invested, and I can't do it. Well, if I can't do it, if I've just confessed that I can't do it, then is it any wonder that in the previous paragraph we see out of control emotions? So it now reads, this has been terrible. The treatment of my mothers and sisters, right at the moment, it's unspeakable horror. Here, an infernal machine is at work, blah, blah, blah. Having said all this, I confess that I haven't been able to will their eternal recurrence. So what the two together say is that I have not been able to master my feelings of renunciation toward my mother and sister. And when I am unable to master feelings of renunciation, this is what I sound like. This is what I have failed to master. So I'm not sure that this text is an out of control and out of perspective text of a man descending into madness. It sounds to me like a quite in control text of someone who's saying, would you like to see what I'm trying to master all the time, and that I would fail to master in this case by not being able to will the eternal recurrence of my other sister? Here's what I look like. Here's the out of control nature that I'm constantly struggling to bring into proportion and bring into a connection with the actual realities of things. So that it becomes readable, and Montanari just didn't read far enough. I'm not sure Montanari's a good reader. Okay. Now, let's see. Let's just look at it. Let's skip a little bit back to Dad. And look at this line. I'll give you a reading of this. I'll give you the dimensional reading of this line. Can we do that without the? No, we're going to have that on there. The greatest individuals are the oldest. I do not understand it, but Julius Caesar could have been my father, or even Alexander, that Dionysus incarnate. At this moment, as I'm writing this, postman brings me a Dionysus head. I'm not sure that this is asterisk to Duncan Lodge's translation. I don't know if he says it or someone else says it, but it's possible that someone was mailing him a postcard from Greece, because he never got to visit Greece. So that may not mean anything. But this sounds like this does mean something. The great individuals of those, I understand, you see it could be my father or Alexander. Why would you say that? One interpretation is that Nietzsche is so insanely megalomaniacal that he is has disassociated himself from the lowly origins of birth from his parents, and has decided to create an imaginary genealogy for himself. This is kind of Starr-Kaufman's, an imaginary genealogy for himself, in which he grandly sees himself as a descendant from Caesar or Alexander. But that's not the only way to read it. When you tie up the remarks about his father together, they all can all be seen to have a quite different meaning. Firstly, remember the first thing he said about his father, that in the first lines of Ecce Homo, as my father I am already dead, as my mother I still living and growing old, this double descent, he says, from the highest and lowest rung on the ladder of life. Now, that was already a problematic sentence, because we were talking about father and mother, and then we're talking about the highest and lowest descent on the ladder of life, and we've talked about father as being already dead. Okay. The temptation, I suppose, certainly the temptation of Sarah Kaufman and Paul Bishop and others, had been to align the highest rung on the ladder of life with mother and the lowest rung on the ladder of life with father, but that's unintelligible. Nietzsche certainly would not have said that he descended from the highest rung on the ladder of life by being the son of his mother. That's crazy. Both lines of descent are from the father, and he achieves the descent from the highest rung on the ladder of life by engaging the resistance that his father poses as the source of compulsive feelings of renunciation and retaliation that he has to struggle against, and the struggle against becomes a being of overflowing life. So, is that nonsense? Why would that be nonsense? I mean, if, in fact, there was transgenerational epigenetic heredity, and Nietzsche keeps saying something happened, and I achieved some kind of life weakness of life force received from my father. As I say, we're never going to know the facts, but increasingly it seems clear that he is dealing with an epigenetic, what you would call his epigenetic father in himself. And somehow that distortion of his base genome was related to the disease that ultimately led to Ludwig's death, and from the loss of 1/4 of his brain, probably through brain tuberculosis. Okay. If then Nietzsche did face this tremendous life-destroying resistance from his father, and engaged it, and by engaging a resistance to life in himself, became ascended to the highest rung on the ladder of life, then what was the mechanism that achieved that? Himself. I myself am the author of that highest life, am I not? I did it. So that sentence, I'm a descendant of the highest rung on the ladder of life is already what you would call a statement of autogenesis, of self-genesis. Auto is self, genesis, origin. So, maybe this is a further figurative expression of his autogenesis. That if I want to continue with the figure of my father, since I did not receive life from my father, he tells us that in the section 3 that this replaced, which we'll look at in a moment. Since I did not receive life from my father, and since this highest rung on the ladder of life that I achieved by my own relentless self-overcoming, if I want to continue the figure of parenthood of that life, well, it would be the parent, as I look into myself, of what there is in me that relentlessly fought my father and brought me to this highest rung on the ladder of life. I was a conqueror.
That's Caesar.
I was a warrior.
Alexander.
But it's not just accidental, no, it doesn't end up saying I was Michelangelo and Botticelli. Why Caesar now? Because I was the relentless self-conqueror. So a little better. As far as the final version of section 3, I can say something about being a Polish nobleman, going back to a text of the summer of 1882. I think I misstated that date in the last video. The summer of 1882, before Lou Salome and Elizabeth Nietzsche met. I can tell you quite a good deal about, we made a pretty good argument about, for meanings of divinity in Nietzsche that associated with the new nobility. I can make a pretty good case for the deliberate nature of the composition of the remarks about his mother and sister as out of proportion to any reality that he got from them, treatment from them, by saying that he's intentionally revealing his lack of self-mastery. And I can make a point about Caesar and Alexander. So we're doing quite a bit here to chop away at the claim that this late text is insane. Right. Let me now compare this to the text that it replaced. So this was the text of section 3, Ecce Homo wise, up until late December of 1888. Again, we'll, let me see. I don't think I have to go early with this. Well, yeah, maybe I should. I have a double series of experiences. I live in apparently separate worlds. I am a double walker, and he'll tell you that he has a foot beyond life. Even by, okay. Now we're going to go into an alternating sequence of the dual series of experiences. On the one hand, I am a good European, but on the other hand, I'm more German than any present-day Germans. And yet my ancestor, maybe the double series starts here, and yet my ancestor is a Polish nobleman. I might even have the free veto, the right of free veto. Never mind about that. It's not important right now. Let's hear it. When I consider how often I am addressed as a Pole when I travel, even by Poles themselves, which actually happened early on in his travels, and he, just for a short time, and how rarely I am taken for German, it might seem that German has been merely externally sprinkled on me. That's kind of odd. Now, if we're talking about a guy who, remember, you're supposed to like read it cumulatively. I'm already dead. I've just told you that I'm a doppelganger. I have a shadowy second self. Could it be that this whole remark about being Polish is his experience of others' interpretation of him? In other words, I am a doppelganger, he says. I'm a double walker. I have a shadowy second self. I walk with a foot beyond life. I'm from the lowest rung on the ladder of life, and this is my being already dead as my father. All of that is a big gap in being present in the world, a foot beyond life. And yet, so people look at me, and they can't quite figure me out. What's this foot beyond life that I'm encountering when I encounter nature? I mean, I'm not formulating it as that, but I sense something odd about him, not fully present in the world. And maybe people sensing that filled it in with, well, maybe you're Polish. Maybe that's the unusual thing. And I think that's all that's going on here. Because he's got the double series of experiences, it should somewhat line up with the idea of the double descent. But anyway, that's one. But this is odd because I could just be sprinkled with what's German, but that's really impossible because on my mother's side I'm completely German. And similarly, my grandmother on my father's side was completely German. She lived all her youth in Weimar, and she had some connection with the Circle of Goethe. But what he's going to do here is mention major figures of German culture that associate him with the mainstream of German society. So his grandmother on his father's side, her Mutter, was in Goethe's circle. Her brother taught for theology at Königsberg, and Königsberg is associated with Kant. And he came to Weimar after the death of Herder, and Herder was the successor of Herder. And if we look up the dates, we'll see that he would have been at Königsberg at the time of Kant, and probably attended Kant's lectures. We don't know that for sure, but it's very hard not to think that a professor of theology would not have had some awareness of Kant's theories about religion within the limits of reason. It is not possible that my great-grandmother is mentioned in the diary of Goethe at all, but the second marriage of my grandmother, Rosa Krause, was with Superintendent Nietzsche, and that's my grandfather. And he was superintendent in Eilenburg. And in the Great War Year of 1813, on the day that Napoleon ended Eilenburg, with the general staff on the 10th of October, she gave birth to his father. Now, and before we get to his father, however, we get this sentence. As a Saxon, she was a great admirer of Napoleon. It could be that I still am too. There's much that you could write quite a few articles just on the use of Napoleon, Napoleonana. I have the pulse of Napoleon, and lots of references to Napoleon throughout Nietzsche's writing. But that's again a conqueror. This could mean that I am an admirer of Napoleon still in my self-conquest. And that's what we're seeing as my admiration of Napoleon, that I achieved the self-conquest of my father. And then comes the reference to my father. The dates tell everything. He died at 36. He has no negative things to say about it. Never does. Always remembers him with deep attention, just as he will in the next section. In section 4, he'll talk about I am a continuation of my father's life after his all too early death. This is a very affectionate thing to say. My poor father, as I carry him around in me, my epigenetic ghost of my father, in reacting to situations in the world that would have caused him to sink even further into his abyss, I am able to forestall that reaction and reverse it and create life in myself from where he would have just sunk into death. And so it's as if I give life to my epigenetic father and extend his life beyond his all too early death. There's a loving, caring thing to say. It's always loving, caring remarks about his father, except for a remark we're going to come up to is not so loving. So it's a little bit of his history, but then this paragraph, I consider it a great privilege to have had such a father. It doesn't say why yet. It even seems to me that this explains whatever else I have privileges. And what's that line? Not including life. The great yes to life. That sentence says that I did not receive life from my father. Certainly not the great, and this is almost a derisive comment, certainly not the great affirmation of life that I achieved for myself. That didn't come from Dad. And which allows us to infer maybe exactly the opposite was the condition of my father, a great renouncer of life as he sunk further and further into his whatever his life-weakening disease was, and became more renouncing as his will to life became weaker. So, where did my life, where does life as my father come from? Who is my father? See? I didn't get it from father. So when you go back to the final section 3, the final version, Caesar or Alexander could have been my father. In this context, it doesn't sound like megalomania. It sounds like a rather complex reflection upon not having received life from my father, having achieved a great affirmation of life due to the resistance caused to life in me from being the child of my father that I had to overcome, and that I am the self-creator of that great affirmation of life. I am my own father, or if we want to continue to state it not so boldly and not so literally, no. If I go beyond myself, who knows? How else would you put it? Am I a descendant of Caesar? Is that what gave me the strength of? I don't know. But there's a non-egotistical core thought there that I, from a source of strength unknown to me, one could figuratively place it anywhere, but in any strong self-conquering or conquering hero, but from a source of strength unknown to me, really, in its identity, I created that life in myself. I created this great life, the great yes to life in myself. It says it. It says it. And what it says is not philosophy. It says something empirical. And the only subject that could study that is psychobiology. I didn't get life from my father, the great yes to life, certainly not. And that came to me as my own self-effort. And whether that's true or false, or possible or not possible, is all the subject of psychobiology. Can a human being so overcome an epigenetic endowment of non-life that he can afterwards speak of an abundance of life, and then are there cases in which that abundance could appear as a great affirmation? Which is quite different from saying, Nietzsche thought that it was good to affirm life, and that's the only position philosophy has. And a silly position. It's a childish position. It's a childish position because it stays within philosophy. Nietzsche affirmed life only because the self-overcoming of the epigenetic endowment led to affirmation. That is to say, Nietzsche affirmed life because the epigenetic inheritance from his father was one of renunciation. And for someone reversing compulsive renunciation, the aliveness to come from that reversal expresses itself in the coloration of affirmation. But it's no more than, it's not an end in itself. It's just a secondary accompaniment to the creation of life in yourself. And someone who had an epigenetic endowment from a father who was not imposing, who did not leave the offspring with feelings of renunciation, might still engage that father and might still come away with an abundance of life that doesn't have the coloration of affirmation, but is just as much the same Nietzschean project. Affirmation is just a secondary effect. The primary effect is I'm more alive. Now, if you're Nietzsche, I can't separate being more alive from affirmation, but that's only because of the epigenetic beginning. Affirmation, as a merely thought process of the brain, is not a value intrinsically in Nietzsche. And to try to turn it into one, as so many authors do, as the failure of philosophy to be Nietzsche. Nietzsche is not a philosopher. And that's fine. It's a good thing. Okay. So I think that's quite a significant sentence. I've always put a lot of weight on that. That tells so when I say I'm already dead as my father, I'm at the lowest run of life as my father, I have a second foot that walks beyond life, and that's I'm in that respect a double walker, and this foot beyond life maybe was puzzling to people who couldn't quite figure out why external environmental processes had not completely affected me. There seemed to be a piece of me beyond life that was unaffected, and came forward to interpret that unaffected part as maybe, well, maybe are you Polish? So much for not having a reading of the Polish figure as a way to read that. We can read this text. And Montanari is wrong. The end of Nietzsche is not chaos. The end of Nietzsche is lucidity in exactly what he was intending in writing a foreword to his magnum opus. And this is the perfect foreword to it. Unfortunately, whatever happened, happened. And we didn't get the 4 books of the revaluation. We only got 1 book. But this is not a chaotic text at all. It requires no resolve on my part, but merely bidding my time to end involuntarily into a world of lofty and delicate things. I've almost paid my life for this privilege. Is certainly no unfair trade. This is a disturbing sentence, though. In order to understand anything at all of my Zarathustra, one must perhaps be similarly conditioned as I am, with 1 foot beyond life. That's the doppelganger. But this sentence, I think, can be read as a lament that maybe this is why no one understood Zarathustra. Because I'm not expecting lots of people to come along with an epigenetic such as I have that conditions my aliveness. But without it, maybe you can't understand Zarathustra. So maybe that's what happened. And because that's what happened, I'm going to tell you about that conditioned aliveness here in Ecce Homo before we go any further with my studying my contribution. So that's what went wrong with Zarathustra. It didn't have the forward of Ecce Homo. So now we're going to repeat the main teachings of Zarathustra in part 4, because we have the plans for the 4 books of the revaluation of all values, and the 4th book was going to be on the eternal recurrence. And I can't imagine that he would have discussed the eternal recurrence in that 4th book without discussing the problematic of redemption and rehashing the whole basic understanding it, and that required introduction is, I am already dead as an epigenetic father. What do you think, Shelley?
Great.
Gradually breaking down, yeah, isn't it?
Yeah, it's coming clearer. And
Comes clearer. And
yeah, you actually taught us about this once last year, a year ago, or a year and a half.
Right.
And yeah, I remember you said more about one foot beyond life
Wow.
last time, but not, you didn't mention Lamarck.
Lamarckian, yeah, Lamarck.
Because you wasn't interested in biology.
I hadn't really put that piece together. It makes a
Yeah.
huge difference.
Yes.
It really does.
It can explain more.
Doesn't it?
Using epigenetics and Lamarck
Doesn't it?
things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how, I haven't really done enough to work on Lamarck's actual theories to know which held up and which haven't, but certainly something that epigenetics is studying seems to be what's under discussion in these texts. And the more direct statement, I inherited a general lack of life force from my father. So that's how I think about it. I carried my epigenetic father around with myself, and he was posed a resistance as compulsive thoughts and feelings of renunciation and retaliation, and but there was nothing wrong with my brain. I mean, on one scenario, what happened is I inherited as transgenerational epigenetic heritability a bunch of epigenetic markers calling for overexpression or downregulation of genes to accommodate a decaying brain, except that there was nothing decaying in my brain. It was just fine. So I'm getting all kinds of signals in my brain to do things that it doesn't have to do. It doesn't want to do. It's just fine the way it is. Struggling against that epigenetic father in myself, I fought it and became, I didn't just fight it. I mean, I fought it, but I also learned something in the fighting of it. I fought it, I became a being of overflowing life in fighting it, but I also, in so doing, I was noticing in all of the times of my fighting that I was revaluing the existing system of values. So that I began to notice in section 4 that in the situation of a wrong being done to me, and which I would ordinarily react to by wanting to strike back, I noticed that given that first order configuration, wanting to strike back in retaliation for a wrong done to me, if I want, seeing that being life destroying, if I want to undermine it, what I do to undermine it is to take the blame for the wrongdoing as my wrongdoing. Say, I'm to blame for that wrongdoing against me, which really makes no sense. But it's meant not to make any sense. It only makes no sense because it undermines Christian thinking. So Nietzsche begins to notice, hey, every time I reverse this, I seem to be reversing the values of Christianity. And so that the value that would take me in the direction of condemning wrongdoing, believing myself to be entitled not to be wronged, equal entitled not to be wrong, I'm exploring as I'm fighting, and which is also an empirical exploration and not a philosophical critique. I'm exploring how, in reversing the inclination to want to strike back, I'm exploring the value system of Christianity and seeing that it's taking me, or would want to take me, in the direction of declining life, and in reversing it, I'm taking myself in the direction of ascending life. And this is going on over and over as I engage my epigenetic father and overcome him, I'm noticing that I'm achieving a reversal of the current set of values that Christianity has imposed on the world. Most importantly, the value of equal rights. And so this is how I became committed to a kind of Aristocratism, is because in studying equal rights, in studying the cases in which I began to feel equality, like equal rights not to be wrong, I noticed that those were full of my father's feelings of vengefulness. And then I began to think about the preachers of equality in general, and Rousseau and Mill, and all the way down to John Rawls. And today, the tradition continues. And in all of that, I think Nietzsche would say, we see the desire to strike back in revenge. So what we need is a new aristocracy that overthrows equal rights. And so that means that we need someone to lead that, and that means that someone has to come forward and say who they are to be in the position to lead that, and that person is me, and the statement of who I am to be in that position is Homo. That's why I wrote it, to tell you who I am, to claim the right to revalue all values. Because every time I struggled against my epigenetic father, I noticed that I was struggling against the values of Christianity. Now, why that is another question. I don't know. Every time I struggle against my epigenetic father, I struggle against my Christianity. That's what happened. That would be a deep thing to try to understand. I hope you could. Okay. So both cases, both versions, the true version and the early version of Wise 3, when we put them all together, they pretty much say, I did not receive life from my father. I am the author of my own life as a great yes to life, an overabundance of life. I created that in myself. I don't know where I got that. Maybe I just inherited it from my grandmother, and one sees my admiration for Napoleon in my self-conquest. Maybe Caesar or Alexander is my father, and that's where it comes from. Who knows? But wherever it comes from is irrelevant. I have within myself a powerful self-conquering ability to master destructiveness. And that's what I'm, in all of this talk about my father is really a disguise for statements of orogenesis. Okay? Okay, you can, that's about